The program mode, or P on your mode dial, is often overlooked. It's almost like an extra auto mode, but it does let you have control over some of the key features. These include the flash, ISO, white balance, and exposure compensation, which the camera controls in that fully automatic mode. It does select an appropriate shutter speed and aperture to get a good exposure, or what it thinks might be a good exposure, but you can change this with the main dial. It will keep the same exposure though, so if you increase the shutter speed, it will change the aperture, and vice versa. If you close down the aperture, it will increase your exposure time. Also, as the light changes in your frame, it will change the settings accordingly. So normally in auto, if the camera thinks it needs a flash, it will pop up and fire when you take a photograph. But in P mode, you can control when you want the flash. So you have more control over how the final image will look. Now with ISO in auto mode, the camera chooses the ISO level and you don't even have that option available. But in this mode, you can select whatever ISO you want from auto right through to the maximum ISO amount. Then the camera will change the other two settings accordingly to get good exposure. With white balance, you may want to give the shot a specific look, or the camera might get a little bit confused and you might want to take control of your white balance. But if you're in fully auto mode, the camera chooses without you having any input or any say in the matter. Now in the P mode, you get to choose the white balance if you want to. You can either leave it in auto white balance or choose one of the pre-designated selections, or even just set your own Kelvin number. Lastly, if you think the camera hasn't quite got the exposure right in auto mode, you don't have any choice. It will take the photo when you press that shutter button, and you have no control over whether you think the exposure is too dark or too bright. But in P mode, you can use exposure compensation. Now your camera might have a plus minus button, and that's exposure compensation, or if you shoot with the Sonys, it's the dial on the right hand shoulder of the camera. Exposure compensation is basically a way where you can override the camera's exposure settings. So if the camera has got it a little bit wrong, you can add a bit of exposure, or you can darken the shot down by taking away a bit of the exposure. Now, even though this sounds great, there are some downsides to the P mode. When you want to change one setting or dial in a bit of exposure compensation, it will change both aperture and shutter speed to suit. But you might not want to do that. You may be at your lowest shutter speed when shooting handheld, and you won't want that shutter speed to drop any lower, but it won't allow you to do this. Now, this is where shutter priority comes into play, or if you want to control your aperture, where aperture priority comes into play. So even though program mode has its place, I think aperture priority or shutter priority are much better functions to try when you first come out of auto. You do need to be in a stress-free environment and have time to play with the camera and the settings, but if you do this, you'll really learn a lot about your camera in a relatively short space of time. Whereas if you're in P mode, it might still be a little bit frustrating to get control of your camera. Now, to learn how to come out of auto mode forever, click on this next tutorial here, and to learn about manual mode, click on this video down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.